her reflection forbidden since she was a girl. A Lakota chief held up water and let her look. The rifle was cold in my hands when I first saw her. That's how I remember it. Not her face, not first, just the cold of the iron against my palm and the sound of her breath, fast and shallow, coming from behind the cottonwood near the creek bank. I'd been following deer tracks since before sunup, moving quiet along the draw the way my father had shown me 40 years gone, and I nearly walked past her. Nearly. She was crouched down low in the roots, arms around her knees, and she was not crying. That's the thing I noticed. A woman alone on Burnt Ridge at that hour, hidden in a tree's roots like something the earth was trying to swallow, and she was not crying. Her jaw was set hard. She was just waiting, for what I didn't know then. I lowered the rifle and stood still, the way you do with a deer that's caught your scent but hasn't bolted. Give it room. Don't move too fast. Let it decide. She looked up at me, and her eyes, they were steady. Not afraid of me, exactly. More like she had decided there was no point in being afraid of anything else today, that she had used up that particular thing. Her name was Winona. She told me that first thing before I asked, like she wanted me to know she was a person with a name and not something lost. She was Lakota like me, but she was not from our band. She'd walked 3 days from a camp east of the ridge alone with nothing but a blanket and a small bundle tied at her waist. She didn't tell me why, not then. I didn't ask. I said I had venison from the night before back at my fire, and that she was welcome to eat if she was hungry. She stood up out of those roots, and there was blood on her left foot, wrapped in a piece torn from her blanket. She walked without limping. I noticed that too. I should tell you something about who I was then. My name is Chayton. I had been chief of our band for 11 years at that point. Before that, I was war chief under my Uncle Motto, who was a man so certain of everything he did that the certainty alone was half his power. When he died, the people looked at me, and I took the weight of it. You don't refuse that, not if you are who you are. 11 years of leading means 11 years of making choices where every side of the choice has a cost. Which pasture? Which treaty council to attend and which to avoid? Which young men to hold back from a raid that will cost us more than it gains? I had gotten good at the weight of choices, or anyway I had gotten used to it, which is not the same thing. I had a wife once. Her name was Thashina Hershal, and she died of the fever in the 3rd winter of my chieftaincy. We had no children that lived past infancy. After she died, I had the band to tend, and that is what I tended. Some of the elder women had thoughts about finding me a new wife, and they said so plainly, the way elder women do. But I told them I was fine, and eventually they stopped saying it to my face, though I know they kept saying it to each other. I was 51 years old when I found Winona in the tree roots. My knees ached in cold weather. My hair was going to gray at the temples. I had a scar across my left jaw from a crow lance point that had taken off a piece of skin and left something puckered and silver in its place. I was not a young man, and I had not felt like a young man in a long time. She ate the venison without speaking much, tore it apart with her fingers and ate steadily, looking at the fire. When she was done, she sat back and looked at her wrapped foot and then looked at me. She said, "I am not going back." I said, "I didn't ask you to." She looked at me again, like she was checking the answer against my face to see if it matched my words. Whatever she saw, she didn't argue with it. I dressed her foot properly. I had elk sinew and a good needle in my pack, and a poultice of yarrow I'd been carrying since early spring. The cut was deep but clean. She didn't make a sound while I worked. I asked her if there were people looking for her. She said, "There are men who will look. Whether they are my people is a different question." "That's a careful answer," I said. "I am a careful woman," she said. "It cost me most of what I have being careful." I didn't push at it. I told her that my camp was a half-day's walk south and that she could come or stay as she chose. If she came, she'd be under my protection, which in our territory meant something. If she stayed, the ridge was cold and the next rain was probably 2 days off. She said, "What does your protection cost?" I said, "Nothing, I don't trade that." She looked at me for a long time. Then she stood up and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. She said, "Then I'll walk with you." The camp was a winter camp, not large, maybe 30 lodges spread along the creek bend where the bluffs cut the wind. We got in late afternoon when the light was coming sideways and gold through the cottonwoods, and the children were loud and the dogs were loud, and a woman was scraping a hide near the fire circle. I brought Winona to the lodge of Red Leaf Woman, who was the oldest woman in the band and the most sensible, and I told Red Leaf the situation plain. A woman, alone under my protection. Tend her foot. Give her what she needs. Red Leaf looked at Winona the way old women look at things, thorough, without opinion showing. Then she opened her lodge flap and said, "Come inside." That night I went to my own lodge and lay down and listened to the fire settle and thought about what I had done. It was a small thing, maybe. A woman needed help and I gave it. That's not a complicated thing for a man who is supposed to lead people. But there was something else sitting in my chest that I didn't have a word for. Something like attention. Like a part of me had woken up that had been very quiet for a long time. I put it aside. I had work to do. I always had work to do. She stayed. That surprised me a little. I had expected she would rest a few days and move on, find her own way to wherever she was going. But 3 days passed, and then a week, and she was still there. She'd made herself useful immediately. She was a skilled beadworker, and she started helping 2 of the young women with a project they'd been struggling with, and she helped with the cooking, and she knew medicines. Red Leaf said she knew the plants well, which was not easy praise from Red Leaf Woman. I didn't see her much in those first days. I was busy. There was a council meeting about grazing rights with a neighboring band, and 2 of the young men had gotten into trouble at the trader's post, and there was always something. There is always something when you are chief. That's the truth of it. But I saw her, glimpses. She moved quietly, efficiently, with that same set jaw I'd noticed at the creek bank. She smiled sometimes with the children, a quick thing she didn't seem entirely comfortable with, like she had to remember how. She didn't push herself forward. She didn't explain herself to people who didn't ask. I noticed that nobody had told her to leave. In my experience, people who are going to have trouble fitting somewhere, you know it by the second day. The camp either opens to someone or it doesn't, and you feel it like weather. With Winona, and I heard people starting to call her that, using her name, which is a sign with her, the camp just quietly opened. It was maybe 3 weeks in when I learned the real story. Red Leaf told me, because Red Leaf was the kind of woman who believed a leader needed to know the things he needed to know, whether he'd asked or not. She sat me down over tea and she said, "The woman's name is Winona Stands Tall. She was a girl in the camp of a man named Hollow Bone east of the ridge. Her mother died when she was small. Her father's brother raised her, and he was a man who had some kind of sourness in him that he spent on her. He told people and said it to her face, which is worse, that her face was bad medicine, that to look upon it brought ill fortune." I said, "What?" Red Leaf said, "You heard me." She had been a girl of maybe 6 or 7 when this started, a child. And because this man had standing in the camp, and because her mother was dead and there was no one to say otherwise, it had stuck. People had let it stick. She had grown up being told not to look at herself, told to keep her eyes down when she passed still water, told that her own face was a thing that caused harm. She had been passed from the camp of Hollow Bone to a marriage with a man named Elk Runner, who was not cruel exactly, but who believed the story because it had been told to him, and he saw no reason to question it. She had lived in Elk Runner's lodge for 7 years. No children that lived. He had begun to say that was her fault too, that her face, her medicine, was the reason. So she left. 3 days on foot, alone in the early cold, with a cut foot and nothing but a blanket. And she had told me that first morning, "I am not going back," not as a plea, just as a statement of the most basic fact she owned. I sat with that for a while after Red Leaf stopped talking. Then I said, "Who in this camp has said anything to her about her face?" Red Leaf said, "No one. They don't know. I'm telling you because you're the one who ought to know, not because it's anyone else's story to tell." I said, "Good, it stays that way." Red Leaf looked at me, and there was something in her look that I recognized as a woman deciding not to say a thing she was thinking. She drank her tea. I drank mine. I left and stood outside in the cold for a while looking at the hills. What I felt then, I'll try to say it straight the way I remember it. I felt something harden in me that was not anger exactly, though it was close to it. Anger at Hollow Bone. Anger at Elk Runner. Anger at a camp full of people who had let a child be told her own face was a curse and had not pushed back against the man saying it. But underneath the anger was something quieter. Something that said, "This one is here, and she is mine to look after, and I am going to do that correctly." I am aware that sounds like I am making myself the center of her story. I am trying not to do that. It was her story, her life, her survival. She had walked out of it herself on her own 2 feet. All I am saying is what happened in me. A man recognizes the thing he's been put in front of to do. I started to see her more after that. Not deliberately, or maybe a little deliberately, I won't pretend otherwise, but also because I was keeping a quiet eye, the way you keep a quiet eye on anything in your care. She was fine. She was more than fine. I kept having to adjust my sense of her. I'd think I understood the shape of her, and then she'd say something or do something that was larger than the shape I'd made, and I'd have to widen it. She had a mind. That sounds like a small thing to say, but I mean it as a large thing. She had thought carefully about a great many things, and she had opinions that she'd worked out herself, not borrowed from what she'd been told. I found this out because one evening I was sitting near the fire working through a problem about the spring hunt, and she was nearby doing beadwork, and without looking up she said, "The east draw is better. The elk come down later there, but the ground doesn't give you away the way the north approach does." I said, "How do you know the east draw?" She said, "I walked through it twice in the last week." I looked at her. She had gone out and learned the land. On her own. Because she was the kind of person who learned the land she was standing on. After that I started talking to her properly. Not about herself, not yet, but about the camp, the problems, the decisions I was working through. She listened well. She asked questions that showed she had been listening. Twice she said something that shifted how I was thinking about a problem, and both times what she said was right. I noticed I looked for her in the camp. I noticed I didn't like the days I didn't see her. I was 51 years old and I recognized what was happening in me, and I also knew enough about myself and about her situation to hold it carefully. She had just walked out of one man's claim on her. She did not need another man immediately filling that space, even with good intentions. So I held it carefully, and I let things move at the pace they were going to move at. The trouble came in the 5th week. Elk Runner came looking for her. He came to the edge of the camp with 2 men, which was either meant to show strength or to have witnesses. I wasn't sure which. I went out to meet them, just me. I didn't bring anyone with me. He was a lean man, maybe 40, with a narrow face and the look of someone who was currently performing calm over something that was not calm. He said the woman was his wife, and he had come for her. I said, "She's been given protection by this band. She's not leaving unless she chooses to leave." He said some things then. He said she was bad medicine. He said she'd brought bad luck to his lodge. He said the whole story Hollow Bone had told about her face, and as he said it his voice had that particular tone of a man who believes a thing so completely he can't hear how it sounds to other ears. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt. When he was done I said, "What you've told me is that for 7 years you let a woman live in your lodge believing her own face was a curse put on her, and you've come here expecting me to send her back to that." He said, "It's true. Ask anyone who knows her history." I said, I'm not asking anyone. I'm asking you to look me in the face and tell me you believe that a woman's face is a curse. He looked at me. I said, because I think you know better than that. I think you've been telling yourself a story that was convenient and you'd like me to help you keep telling it. He said something about what his rights were. I let him finish. Then I said, she's not your wife anymore. She walked away. In my camp, a person who walks away has walked away. You're welcome to take up any dispute you have about it at a proper council, with proper witnesses, and we'll see how that sits. But you're not taking her from here today. And if you come back here without invitation, I'll treat it as a trespass. The two men with him were watching me. Elk Runner looked at them. Then he looked at me. He turned and left. I stood and watched until they were past the ridge line and gone. Then I went back to the camp. I didn't say much about it to anyone. Red Leaf asked me that evening how it had gone. I told her he was gone. She nodded. A few days later, I heard that Winona had been told, by someone, I suspect Red Leaf, who believed in people having information about their own lives, that Elk Runner had come, and that I had sent him away. She didn't come to me about it, not right away. I didn't expect her to. There is a creek that comes down off the North Bluff, fed by a spring, and in the late autumn before the cold really sets in there are 3 or 4 days when the water slows and goes glassy and still in the wide pool below the boulders. I go there sometimes in the mornings because it's quiet, and because the elk drink there, and because I have always thought more clearly near water than away from it. I was there one morning, maybe a week after Elk Runner's visit, when I heard someone coming down the path. I turned. It was Winona. She had a water vessel, a reason to be there, but she stopped when she saw me, and I could tell the water vessel was secondary. She said, "You didn't tell me he came." I said, "It wasn't mine to tell you. Red Leaf would have, or someone would have. It's your business to know." She stood a few feet away from me looking at the pool. The water was flat and gray and silver that morning, the kind of still that holds light instead of showing it. She said, "He told you what Hollow Bone said, about my face." I said he did. She said, "And?" I said, "And it's not true. You know it's not true. I think you've known for a long time that it's not true. Doesn't mean the knowing came easy." She was quiet for a while, looking at the pool, not at me. Then she said, "I haven't looked at my own reflection in I can't remember how long, since I was small. Before my mother died, I think she showed me once in a bowl of water and said I was beautiful. I remember that. And then Hollow Bone said what he said, and I stopped. I didn't say anything. I let it sit. She said, "I know how it sounds. A grown woman who won't look at her own face. I know how it sounds." I said, "It sounds like something started when you were too young to fight it, and then it becomes a habit of protection. You protect yourself from the thing that hurts. That's not weakness. That's what you do when something hurts and no one helps you fight it." She looked at me then, directly. She had a way of looking that was full, like she wasn't saving anything back. I said, "Would you like to?" She said, "What?" I said, "Look." I didn't make a speech about it. I didn't tell her it would change everything, or that she needed to, or that I thought she was beautiful, though I did think that. I'll say it plainly. I did think she was beautiful, and I'd been thinking it for weeks. But I didn't say it because that wasn't what the moment needed. I knelt down at the edge of the pool. The water was still. My own face looked back at me, silver and clear. I looked up at her. I said, "Come here." She came and knelt beside me, very close. I could feel the warmth of her arm near mine. She looked down at the water. I watched her look at her own face, maybe for the first time in 20 years or more. I watched her look at it, and I watched the moment move through her. I couldn't have told you what it was exactly. I'm not a man who has words for every interior thing, but something passed through her. She was very still. Her jaw was not set hard. Her jaw was just her jaw. Then she said quietly, "Oh." That's all she said. After a while she said, "I thought I'd be afraid to." I said, "I know." She said, "You're in it too, the water." I said, "I know that too." She looked at our two faces together in the still water. The reflection was clean and gray and faithful, an old chief with a scarred jaw, a woman who hadn't seen herself since she was small, both of us there in a pool on a November morning looking. She didn't move away from me. She stayed where she was, close, her arm warm against mine. She said, What is this?" I said, "I don't know exactly. I know it's something." She said, "You sent him away." I said, "Yes." She said, "You didn't have to." I said, "I did have to. That's the thing, I did have to." She looked at me then, not at the water, at me. And she lifted her hand and put it against my chest, just flat against my chest, and I put my hand over hers and we stayed like that for a while without talking. The water moved slightly, some small thing upstream disturbing it, and our reflections shifted and spread and then came back to still. I won't say it was easy after that. Nothing worth having is. There were people in the camp with opinions. There always are. An old chief and a woman who'd arrived alone, and without history anyone could verify, that's going to draw opinions. A few of the men my age, men who had known me long enough to confuse familiarity with authority over my life, said things sideways that meant, "Is this wise?" One elder woman, not Red Leaf had more sense, said something to me about the importance of a chief's household being settled and certain, and not made uncertain by a woman whose past was not fully known. I heard these things. I let people say them. There's a kind of hearing that isn't agreement and isn't argument. It's just listening so that the person knows they were heard, and then going ahead. That's what I did. Winona handled the opinions the way she handled most things, which was with a quiet steadiness that made the opinions seem smaller once they'd met her. She didn't fight them. She didn't placate people. She just went on being exactly who she was, day after day, and after a while the people saying things seemed to get tired of saying them because nothing was responding to what they said. Red Leaf pulled me aside one afternoon and said, "She's a good woman, Chayton." I said, "I know she is." Red Leaf said, "She's been carrying a broken thing for a long time and she's still mostly whole. You'd have to go a long way to find something tougher than that." I said, "I'm aware." Red Leaf looked at me with that expression that old women save for men who are trying to be less transparent than they are. She said, "Then stop moving so carefully and say the thing you're working up to saying." I said, "She doesn't need me to move fast." Red Leaf said, "I didn't say fast. I said stop moving so carefully. There's a difference. She knows what you mean. You're the only one in this camp who thinks he's being subtle." The winter set in hard that year. The kind of cold that doesn't ease up for weeks, that makes the poles crack at night and puts ice in the water vessels by morning. We lost 2 horses to a storm in the first moon of it. I spent a great deal of that month doing the things a chief does in hard weather, making sure the old and the young had enough, making sure the fuel was adequate, settling the disputes that cold and confinement produce between people who are mostly good-hearted but have been inside with each other for too long. Winona helped with all of it. She had the medicines and she was generous with them. She had a way with people who were frightened, the young mothers especially, when the children coughed or ran fever, a way of being calm that didn't dismiss what was frightening them but also didn't add to it. She'd sit with a woman and look at a child and say what she thought clearly and then do what needed doing. People came to trust that. I watched this and I was glad, and I was something else too that I didn't have a word for, or rather I had a word for it but I wasn't sure I had the right to use it yet. The word was pride. Not pride in myself. Pride in her. The specific pride of someone who sees another person be fully themselves and is glad to be near it. There was one night in the middle of the worst of the cold, maybe the 40th day of it, when a child in the far lodge spiked a fever that Winona had been watching. She went to them in the night, and I went too, not because she'd asked me to, but because I was awake anyway and she was going alone, and I was not going to let her go alone into the cold to do difficult work in the dark. We were there for 3 hours. The child was frightened and the mother was more frightened. Winona sat on the floor of that lodge with the child in her arms and talked to him, just quietly talked, about small things, about elk and about the creek, and about what the spring looked like in the hills, and she watched his color and the set of his breathing, and she gave him what she gave him, and she talked. By the 3rd hour the fever had broken and the child was asleep, and the mother was asleep too. We walked back to the fire circle in the gray cold before dawn. The snow was crusted and it held our weight. My breath made a cloud. She was walking beside me and her shoulder was level with mine, and we were close enough in the cold to share warmth. I said, "You were very good in there." She said, "He's a strong little boy. He did most of the work." I said, "That's what good healers say." She looked at me from the side, a quick look. I said, "I want to say something." She said, "Then say it." I said, "I am not a young man. I am not easy. I have a scar on my face and a bad knee, and I have been a chief long enough that I've made enemies I can't always anticipate. My lodge it's quiet. It's been quiet a long time. I don't know that I've made it unwelcoming, but I haven't tried very hard to make it welcoming either." She said, "Is this the thing you're working up to?" I said, "I'm getting there." She stopped walking. I stopped beside her. We were in the middle of the clearing and the sky was beginning to go the gray-green color of early light, and the snow was very white and clean. I said, "What I mean is, you deserve someone saying plainly that they see who you are, not the story Hollow Bone told, not what Elk Runner believed. What is actually there, I see it. I've been seeing it since the creek bank. A woman who walked 3 days alone on a cut foot because she knew the life she was living was a lie and she wouldn't live it anymore. That's not nothing. That's a person. A real one." She was very still, looking at me. I said, "I would like the right to go on seeing it for the rest of my life, if that's something you'd consider." She looked at me for a long time, long enough that I became aware of how cold the air was and how loud my own heartbeat was to me. Then she said, "You sent Hollow Bone's story away, just by not believing it." I said, "I suppose I did." She said, "Do you know how long I've waited for someone to just not believe it?" I didn't have an answer to that. There isn't an answer to that. There's just what it costs to finally hear the answer and what it costs to have waited. She stepped forward and she put her arms around me. Not gently but fully, the way you hold something you mean to hold. And I put my arms around her in the cold clearing with the light coming, and I felt her face against my neck and I held her. I didn't say anything, she didn't say anything. The snow held the quiet. After a while she said, against my neck, "Yes, that's something I'd consider." We were married in the spring. It was a proper thing. The right ceremony, the right witnesses, the elder women involved in the way they wanted to be involved, which I was glad of. Red Leaf presided over part of it. She did so with the expression of a woman whose idea had finally been vindicated by time. There were people who came from other bands who had heard something about who Winona was, the story had traveled, the way things do, and they came and looked. And they saw a woman standing at the side of their chief with her chin level and her eyes steady, and a calm on her face that was not the calm of someone performing calm, but the actual thing. And they saw me. I know what they saw because I was told afterward by more than one person in more than one way. They saw a man who was glad, who stood up straight in a particular way that men don't always stand up straight, who looked at the woman beside him with the specific look of someone who cannot quite believe his good fortune and is going to make himself worthy of it anyway. That is what they saw, and I don't mind them having seen it. A man shouldn't mind being seen glad. That first summer we worked. We expanded the lodge, which had been built for one and was sufficient for one, but is a different thing for two. She had ideas about where the fire should sit, and the direction the opening should face to keep the rain out, and her ideas were right, so we did it her way. This is a sensible arrangement and I recommend it. She built a garden. Not the kind of garden that produces everything. The season was too short for that, but medicinal plants, the ones she needed closest to hand, and a few things she remembered from her mother's lodge. She said, though she said it sideways, not looking at me when she said it, because some things are still tender even after you've survived them. I watched her work in that garden on a July afternoon, down on her knees in the dirt, moving steadily from plant to plant, and I thought, this is a person who made something out of nothing, who came here with nothing but her own 2 feet and the hard knowledge of who she was underneath everything that had been told to her. And she is here, and this is her garden, and she is going to tend it. I am a man who has led people for a long time, and I know the particular satisfaction of being where you are supposed to be, doing what you are supposed to do. I have felt it in councils. I have felt it after difficult decisions that turned out right. I have felt it standing on a ridge in the early morning and seeing the land I was responsible for spread out below me, intact, cared for. That July afternoon watching her in the garden was the most complete version of that feeling I had ever had. Not because I had done something large, because I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I want to tell you about the creek pool again. Not the first time, a later time. It was the second autumn we were together. She had been awake early before me, which wasn't unusual. She was often awake before me, her mind running ahead of her sleep, and when I woke she wasn't in the lodge. I put on my moccasins and went out into the cold blue of early morning, and I knew where she was. She was at the pool below the boulders, not kneeling this time, sitting on a flat rock at the edge with her feet near the water looking in. I stood back and watched, not intruding, just watching. She sat there for a long time looking at her own face in the still water. She looked at it the way you look at something that is yours and that you have not always had and that you are still learning to trust the having of. After a while she heard me, or sensed me, and she turned and looked at me over her shoulder. She didn't ask how long I'd been there. She just looked at me, and then she looked back at the water, at the 2 of us in the water, and she put her hand out beside her on the rock. I went and sat beside her and took her hand. The pool was still. The sky was that pale cold blue of autumn mornings. The cottonwoods were going yellow, and the yellow was in the water too. She said, the first time I looked, I was afraid. I said, I know. She said, I'm not afraid anymore. I said, I know that too. She was looking at the water, at her face, at both our faces. She said, you see me. I said, I do. She said, you always have. She squeezed my hand. I squeezed hers back. We sat by the water for a long time and watched the morning come in. That's it, that's the whole of it. An old chief and a woman who wasn't supposed to look at herself, and a still pool, and a morning in the second year of something good. It doesn't need more than that.